It was well past 10 p.m. when I finished my personal chores. I got up and stretched my rather stiff muscles. Once I deemed myself ready, I walked out of the room and made my way down the hallway. As clumsy as ever, I nearly bumped into John's firm chest. I stumbled back slightly. "John," I said once I regained my balance. "What's up?" The Guardian stepped back.
The medical team arrived an hour ago. They took my mother to a secure location.
My eyes softened. "John, I'm so sorry," I said sincerely. He nodded, though his eyes portrayed the sadness of his situation.
Yeah, it's ironic. For 7 years I believed she was dead, and now that I actually found her, she's taken away from me again.
I snorted and crossed my arms. Life can be quite a bitch. John hummed in agreement.
Simple, yet pretty much sums it up.
I laughed a bit. "That's me. I like to get straight to the point." John chuckled in return, before his face turned serious.
I hate to be such a killjoy, but the head warrior's on, and he's requesting your audience.
Automatically, I adopted a serious attitude and stared at John in wonder. "What is it?" I asked. John shrugged.
I don't know, Rachel. He simply requested everyone's presence before he would say anything.
My eyes furrowed in concern. Whatever Pete had to say, it was probably not good news. "All right, let's go," I said. Wordlessly, I followed John to the conference room where everyone else was already waiting. They all had solemn looks on their faces, which only deepened the tightening inside me. I stepped to the middle where Pete's face was portrayed. He watched me approach with a grim expression.
"Hello, Agent Moore. Now that you're here, I can get started with HQ's update."
The room's air thickened in anticipation.
Mr. Hill provided us with more information.
Pete started.
He has revealed that the Phantoms are after the Shroud.
Gasps were heard all around. My own eyes widened at the seriousness of the situation. The Shroud was built in Switzerland as a symbol of peace. It was the official capital of the Seeker organization, yet it was more for show. The main Seeker power was focused in New York. I breathed deeply and urged myself to be calm. The head warrior continued.
A decision has been made of what the next course of action will be. Agents Fear and Delta are to relocate to Switzerland, along with every other high-ranked Seeker agent. The rest of you will regroup back in America.
My eyes widened in shock. "But sir," I started.
The decision is final, Agent Moore. I'm sorry, but we all have our orders.
Pete replied sternly. I could only nod back slightly, as I felt a heavy weight pit in my gut. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned around and saw John staring at me. His eyes portrayed the same dislike of the situation as I felt. I only gave him a small smile before I turned my head to face the head warrior. I bit my lip as I contemplated on whether or not I really wanted to ask. If the Phantoms do manage to take control of the Shroud, then what will be our outcome? I asked carefully, dreading the answer. Pete stared at me very hard. His brown eyes molted in contained fury.
Then God forbid. The whole world will be in a full-scale war. The Shroud houses many sensitive documents that will only lead to global disaster if they fall into the Phantom's hands.
I felt my face go white as I swallowed hard. The head warrior leaned back into his chair and sighed heavily. He rubbed his head as if soothing an oncoming headache. He stopped the gesture and looked at me again.
You have 8 hours to get yourselves prepared. Agent Moore, I expect to see you and the others back in New York completely ready in 36 hours.
I nodded. "Yes, sir," he replied simply. The head warrior then focused its attention on all of us again.
Be careful, agents. These are dark days ahead of us. Keep each other safe. Pete out.
With that, the connection was cut. I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. There were a couple of light gasps and heavy breathing. Predator let out a loud exhale and paced around the room as he tried to wrap his head around the situation. I turned to face him, as I was slightly annoyed by his movement. He looked at me, and stopped when he saw my face. He let out an aggravated sound, and then stood in the middle of the room.
Alright. I'll be the one to say this. This is all a bunch of bullshit.
My right eye twitched at his outburst, but I realized that Predator was right.
I mean, come on! They send you guys all the way out here for a critical mission, and then they just send you back home? And even better, they're relocating every high-ranked Seeker agent to the Shroud, all on a hunch from some gambler who can't even get a score with a hooker?
He shouted the last part. We all stared at him in stunned silence while he stared back in challenge. As he was the one who knew the demolitions expert the best, Fear moved to Predator's side and placed a hand on his shoulder, companionably. Immediately, Predator flinched and moved away. The assassin stared at him in momentary shock before he regained his composure. Predator looked back at Fear and realized what he did. He looked away in shame and walked towards the door. As he was almost out of the room, he turned towards us.
I'll be packing my stuff,
he said quietly, and then left the room. A heavy silence fell upon us like a thick blanket. None of us knew what to say. Movement from the corner of my eye caught my attention, and I saw Fear make his way towards the door. I sped-walked to him, which caught his attention in return. He turned around slightly and waited for me to say whatever I needed to say. He's stressed, I said. We all are. The assassin merely nodded.
Yes, I know that.
He then turned around completely. Worry was hidden deep in his eyes. I gave Fear a sympathetic look and rubbed his shoulder in reassurance. The outline in his mask ruffled slightly, which allowed me to assume that he was slightly smiling. I smiled back and surprised everyone, even myself, by hugging him tightly. He let out a quick gasp, as he obviously didn't expect my gesture. As usual, he got over his initial shock and wrapped his arms around me, patting my back. I pulled away and stepped back to give the assassin some room. Said person crossed his arms and acted like nothing happened, but I knew that my gesture touched him. I smiled again and winked. He chuckled in return. I coughed as an attempt to get rid of any awkwardness. You take care out there, Fear. Better live up to your name's meaning, I grinned. He smirked.
Oh, please, Agent Moore. This is hardly a challenge.
He then took on a more serious tone.
You take care as well. I don't want to have to save your ass again.
I raised an eyebrow and placed my hands on my hips. Is that so? I replied as I dared him to contradict me. As I recall, you were trying to play hero, and I had used my wits to not get you killed. The assassin just rolled his eyes, but his eyes twinkled in amusement. After a moment, he turned towards the door and waved at me.
Until we meet again, Agent Moore.
With that, he was at the door. I shook my head as I was unable to keep the smile off my face. I turned around and saw John staring at me in confusion. I merely grinned. John shook his head in reply. The other agents stood in the middle of the room, unsure what to do. I sighed and gave them a reassuring smile. You guys should probably pack your things, as we'll be leaving in the morning. Both Elvira and Olsen nodded, and politely made their way past me. It was just me and John. John, I said.
Yeah, Rachel?
He answered as he turned towards me. The words died out in my throat. I couldn't tell him. Said person quirked his head, waiting to hear what I had to say. I looked down, took a deep breath, and looked back at him as I smiled sadly. I wish you all the best, I said softly. John's eyes dimmed slightly, as if his hope was extinguished. The slight hurt on his face made me feel like a part of me died on the inside. I wanted to tell him how I felt so much, but I couldn't. I internally cursed myself for that. John rubbed his head and let out a loud sigh. He then turned to face me.
Care to join me for a drink?
He asked, almost timidly. I smiled gently at his shyness. I was also relieved at the dissipation of the awkwardness. Sure, friend, if you're buying. My guardian seemed to have felt relieved as well, for he regarded me in amusement. I huffed in indignation. Cheap bastard, I muttered. He merely laughed in response. I rolled my eyes and followed John to wherever the booze was kept. He took us to his room. His personal items were arranged in an organized fashion on the round table. There was a double-sized bed on the far wall. John rummaged through a box and then took out 2 sleek bottles. He then went to the kitchenette and grabbed 2 clean glasses. He placed all of the articles on the table and filled both glasses with the amber liquid.
In times like these, I call upon a dear friend of mine. Beer,
he said as he placed the filled glasses in front of me. I snorted in amusement. You're a man of fine taste, I mocked as I held the glass. John smirked.
And you're a woman with a smart mouth. I'm surprised you haven't killed anyone yet with just an appropriate choice of words.
I chose to ignore his remark. I took a deep breath and then brought my glass up. Cheers, I started. To the end of the world. John raised his own glass.
May you be in heaven for half an hour, before the devil knows you're dead.
We clinked our glasses together after our bizarre toast and took generous swings of the cool alcohol. When I was done, I set my glass on the counter. Well, talk about being positive, I remarked sarcastically. John snorted at my remark.
We're in the middle of a war. If you were acting positive, I'd suspect you were on drugs.
I chuckled lowly. I think the same thing. John shook his head in amusement and brought out 2 more beer bottles. He filled our glasses again and downed half in one go. He sighed loudly.
I can't believe Fear and I are being sent to go babysit some luxurious building.
I snorted. At least you're doing something. The rest of us are being called back to New York as if we have a curfew. I paused to drink my beer. I can only imagine what sort of assignment they could give us low-level agents. John went still and regarded me with a serious look.
Come on, Rachel, you know HQ doesn't see you as inferior. You're a scout. Reconnaissance is just as hard as going in head first. It's probably even harder.
He then rested his arms on the counter.
Your rank is a great asset to the warriors. You go in and search the area to ensure their safety. You're practically their guardian.
I smiled slightly at his attempt to make me feel useful. Thanks, John, I said quietly. Said person nodded in return. I downed the rest of my drink and then grinned lopsided. Since we're parting ways, does it still make you my guardian? I joked. John's eyes widened at my question. He then relaxed as he saw me smile.
I believe so,
he replied.
After all, the directors never gave me the order to let you go.
I then stared at John intently. Let me go, huh? John noticed my change of mood and stared at me with an unfamiliar expression. His gray eyes seemed to have turned molten silver, and my breath hitched. It was just like the night to salute to Vienna, although this time it was definitely willingly on my part. John stepped around the table and pulled me up. I stared at him expectantly. He looked back.
Rachel, what were you going to say back in the conference room?
He asked. I opened my mouth, but shut it quickly. I gave him a sad smile as I hoped that my eyes would have somehow been able to tell him what I could not say. You know I'm bad with words. I tried to joke. John nodded. I then placed my hands on his chest and looked at him through a slightly hazed vision. But perhaps I could show you. John's eyes widened momentarily before they closed shut, as I trailed my hands all over his muscular chest until they reached the lining of his shirt. I looked up at him as I voicelessly asked for permission. John nodded and placed his hands over mine. Together, we swiftly took off his shirt. I couldn't help but stare in appreciation It was as if a sculptor made him. I flicked my eyes upward. John's eyes were shining brightly, even in the dim light. His face then curved into a smile.
You like what you see?
He asked, teasingly. A slight blush colored my face. You're beautiful, I said quietly. John chuckled slightly, though there was a hint of bashfulness in his manner. He placed his hand behind my head and gently removed my ponytail. My hair came down in long, thick waves. I shook my head to adjust their position. The guardian caressed my hair, trailing lightly over my skull and down to the ends. I stifled a shiver at the intimate gesture. In return, I traced my thin fingers over John's well-defined jaw. I held my fingers still when they touched his smooth lips. John took both of my hands and kissed them softly. His eyes glimmered like molten silver shining under a light. He smiled at me tenderly as his eyes examined every aspect of my face. I smiled shyly as a result. John then grabbed me by the hips and brought me closer. He brought his face close to mine, causing my heart to accelerate like a race car. As he leaned forward, I parted my lips slightly. His lips hovered over mine. His warm breath caused me to tremble slightly. At last, he pressed his lips against mine, and I closed my eyes. The sensation was amazing. His soft lips fit perfectly against mine, allowing all of my nerves to become electrified in pleasure. I wrapped my arms around his neck as he held onto me tight. John slid his tongue through my pouting mouth and began teasing my own. Not one to give up so easily, my tongue met his, and the small muscles engaged in a minor battle. I giggled slightly. The movement caused me to lick John's bottom lip. He growled slightly, which aroused a mixture of feelings within me. I bit his bottom lip before pulling away. Completely flushed, I rested my head on John's shoulder. He wrapped his strong arms around me in an embrace. We stood in that position for who knew how long, as we just enjoyed each other's company. It was possibly the last time we would have ever seen each other. The frightening thought made me tense up. John leaned back slightly to look at me.
Are you all right, Rachel?
He asked in concern. I shook my head. I'm not, John. We have no idea what would happen, and we're being sent off to probably our deaths. Predator was right. The whole situation is a bunch of bullshit. John tensed up, but quickly relaxed. He ran his fingers through my hair. The gesture soothed me a little, but I kept talking. It's bad enough that we're not 100% sure of what the Phantoms are up to, but the one thing good in my damn life, since my family is now being taken away from me. I automatically shut up. Though I didn't dare to look up at John. His chest vibrated, and when I mustered the courage to look at his face, I realized that he was laughing. He looked down at me and smiled.
So I'm the current best thing in your life, huh?
He grinned. I scowled and slapped his chest lightly. That only made him laugh louder. Eventually, I joined in on the laughter, and I was happy that we were able to find a momentary distraction from the cruel reality. We stopped after a few minutes, and John took my face in his hands.
Don't be sad, Rachel. Once this is all over, I will come back. After all, I am your guardian.
I chuckled slightly at his comment. John looked deep into my eyes.
And know that you too are the best thing that has happened to me since this damn war started.
My heart skipped a beat. So, he does feel the same way. You better come back, I said. John leaned down and kissed me hard. I responded back right away and wrapped my legs around his waist. He held onto them as he led us to the bed. He gently placed me on the mattress, but I pulled him down with me. The fall caused our lower regions to rub against each other. We both groaned as a result. John leaned back.
Rachel,
He said tenderly.
are you sure you want this?
I smiled and pecked him softly in the lips. I've never been surer in all my life, I replied breathlessly. John's eyes softened, causing the blue in them to pop out more. He smiled and then kissed me softly. I wrapped my arms around his neck and lightly trailed my fingers around the area. John broke the kiss to nip at my neck. I moaned quietly and caressed John's strong shoulders. He continued to leave a trail of kisses down my collarbone before he slid a hand inside my shirt and rubbed my firm stomach. I held a breath in anticipation as I waited for him to make the next move. He grabbed the end of my shirt and looked at me expectantly. I nodded, and he immediately pulled my shirt over my head to reveal my simple black bra. He untangled the piece of clothing and threw it on the ground. I couldn't help but blush as John gave my chest an appreciative look over. He pressed his lips against my skin and kissed the area. I moaned in pleasure and arched my chest upwards. John took that as an encouragement and continued his pampering. Eventually, the rest of our clothes came off and we fell into an harmonious pattern. I never felt more alive and whole than I did with John at that moment. I knew that I wanted to spend my life with him. John collapsed beside me and brought me into his arms. I shuffled closer and rested my head under his chin. He kissed my hair and rubbed my shoulders affectionately. That was amazing, I said breathlessly. John chuckled deeply.
Yeah, it certainly was.
He said. I lifted my head up to meet his gaze. You better come back. I'm looking forward to the next time. I smiled slightly. John smiled at me sleepily.
I am too,
He whispered. My eyes softened at his appearance, and my heart curled in adoration. I kissed him softly and resumed my resting place. John's embrace slightly tightened, and I never felt safer than in his arms. I then closed my eyes and fell into a blissful sleep.